So welcome, in with the old, how to preserve our aging housing stock. You know, I feel like I've come full circle at Shinny. I started out in the field 25 years ago, and I started doing panels at the Shinny conferences in the very beginning, and I did a lot of how to develop supportive housing. And now those how to develop supportive housing projects are in need of preservation. So I'm Amy Larovere. I've been working in the field for 25 years, and I'm really happy to be with you this morning. I think that our formerly nascent industry is approaching a milestone. You know, we have had some projects that have been going through preservation, but we are really looking at a watershed of projects that are in need of preservation, and we as a community really need to work together to ensure that all the work we've done over the years keeps our projects thriving and moving forward. So we've assembled a really terrific panel, an all-star panel of folks to take us through some of the complexities associated with preservation projects. You know, a lot of our projects were done with low-income housing tax credits, and we're going to talk about that, but we also have a whole lot of supportive housing projects that were done prior to low-income housing tax credits coming into the market as a tool for us. We have a lot of OMH products out there, OASIS projects, and then projects that just have HPD or OTDA or HCR funding that are well over 15, 20, 25, and even 30 years. And we have to work together to ensure that those projects have the opportunity to remain a resource for our tenants, our in-need tenants. So we're going to talk about all of that today. We are really fortunate here in New York City and New York State. We have great government partners that are willing to work with us. We have committed, supportive, and really, really smart people at HCR, HPD, OTDA, OASIS, all the different funding sources that are working with us. I think it's incumbent on all of us to work together to make sure that that the products that we develop are really responsive to the needs of our projects. You know, most of our buildings are unique. You know, we have some, to an extent, we have some what you could call cookie cutters, but a lot of our projects have some really unique aspects, and we have to make sure that the preservation products that we use to keep them viable respond to the unique aspects of each product. So I'm going to work as the moderator today, and the way we're going to structure this is I'm going to introduce all the panelists, and then each panelist will do their presentation. We'll have some moderator and panelist discussion, and then we will open it up to Q&A with all of you. So our first panelist today is Claire Donnelly, and Claire is the Disposition Manager for Enterprise Community Asset Management. She's representing the syndicator investor position in year 15 preservation. At Enterprise, she works with partners to develop strategies and provide TA for projects going through the year 15 process. Then we have Kerry LaBotz. Kerry has been in the industry for a while. She is currently the director of the Low-Income Housing Preservation Program for HPD. She has a broad background in housing. She was with the new construction unit, and she served as the chief of staff for HPD's director, commissioner of development. She's going to walk us through the different aspects of the year 15 project at HPD. She's been running that program since 2011, I think? 13. And then we have Arlo Chase. Arlo is the Senior Vice President for Real Estate and Property Development for SUS. And like Kerry, Arlo has a broad supportive housing experience. He has been in his current role for about 3 years, but prior to that, Arlo worked as a private developer with Alembic. He worked at HCR in policy, and before that, and I remember all of this, each phase of Arlo's career, he worked as a lawyer for developers at Monell Phillips. And then David Kamnitzer. David is representing the social service aspect of our project. David's been in the field for 30 years, and you've been at ICL as the Senior Vice President for Residential and Supportive Services for the last 15 years. And David's going to talk to us about the tenant aspect of this. We also have some other folks from ICL in the audience that are going to be joining in with us, and David will talk about them. So I'm going to hand this over to Claire to talk about the complexities associated with year 15 disposition with investors. All right.
Can you hear me? Okay. Let me just get this set up.
Okay. Thanks, Amy.
All right, so yeah, I'm here to talk a little bit about the investor perspective at year 15. Whether you've been through the year 15 process before in exiting your investor, or if you're just going through it under different circumstances, there's always some confusion around the process. So I'm just going to try to shed a little bit of light on the investor perspective, how the investor is looking at this, and also on the transfer logistics of how we actually exit the investor. So, as you probably know, the tax credits are earned over a 15-year period and usually delivered over a 10 or 11-year period. The Internal Revenue Code requires a 15-year compliance period, after which the investor usually wants to exit. The compliance period is calculated by looking at the end of the 15th year that the project took tax credits. So it's usually December 31st of the year, of the 15th year that the project took credits. And if it's a multi-building project, that's calculated based on the last building. Okay, so here's a little bit about Enterprise's specific disposition objectives. This isn't necessarily how every syndicator would look at this, but this is our approach, and we look to deliver the investor's expected return and exit in year 15, proactively exit in year 16, I'm sorry. So all of these investments that were made through Enterprise were initially made with the intention of transferring these projects back to the owner after the end of the 15-year period. So that's what we try to do at year 16 in the transfer. We aim to preserve affordability through the extended use period and potentially extend it beyond that if the project is going through the HPD year 15 program. We're able to consider the purpose of the partnership as an affordable housing owner. We aim to minimize the displacement of low-income residents in turning these back over to the nonprofits that own the buildings, and to preserve project viability long-term. So we are noticing in the broader market nationwide, there's a growing pool of interested buyers for limited partner interest. So there are syndicators that are selling off portions of their portfolio to people that are interested in investing for the cash upside of a market flip, essentially. And there are a lot of preservation concerns with that, including having over-leveraged properties that are falling apart over time, either a removal of or a non-compliance with the affordability restrictions on the rents, and which would cause a displacement of tenants through rent increases over time. We hear over and over that one of the best reasons to work with a nonprofit syndicator or enterprise is because of the way we're able to approach the year 15 process. All right, so on to some of the transfer logistics. The investor can exit either through a sale of the property, after which the partnership is dissolved, or through a sale of the investor's 99.99% interest in the project. The terms of the transfer are outlined at the very beginning in the initial agreements in your partnership agreements. Oftentimes the prices or projections made at the beginning don't match the current economics of the transaction, so a lot of times there are negotiations that happen outside of the partnership agreement, in which case the investor approval is usually required. So in those partnership agreements, there are usually a right of first refusal and a buyout option. For nonprofits, the right of first refusal is a discounted price in which, let me just skip to the next slide here. A discounted price where the nonprofit would have the right to purchase the limited partner interest or purchase the property for the price of debt plus exit taxes. Sometimes it's an oversimplification. Sometimes it includes unpaid benefits to the investor if all the tax credits weren't delivered or the project operated differently than it was projected to. And it may or may not be economically advantageous if the fair market value of the real estate at the time is actually lower than the debt plus exit taxes price. That's when the negotiations outside the partnership agreement would occur. So I'm just going to show you a quick example of that. Here. So here you can see the debt plus exit price, debt plus exit taxes price is $2.3 million. And the fair market value of the real estate on the right is 4.5. And you can see the difference in what the limited partner interest is worth if you follow that down. So we'll look at the fair market value of the real estate. Sorry, actually let's start on the left with the right of first refusal price. Add in the assets of the partnership, any cash and reserves. That's, in this example, around $533,000. And subtract out then any payables and fees payable and debt on the partnership to come up with the net assets that would be distributed to at the end or at the time of dissolution. Your partnership agreement will have a waterfall that shows how those assets are distributed or split between the general partner and the limited partner. In this example, it's a 50-50 split. Sometimes you see a 90-10 or a 10-90 split. It varies depending on what the agreements were at the beginning. So you can see in this scenario, the value of the limited partner interest at the rate of first refusal price is a lot lower than what it would be at the fair market value price. But you can imagine if the fair market value of the real estate was really only, say, $2 million, then the right of first refusal price wouldn't be economically, it wouldn't make sense to actually use. There are a number of things that we need to consider when we're looking at the value of the limited partner interest, including what I just said, whether or not it has value in excess of debt. We often can consider capital needs in the calculation. If the building needs a lot of work, that can be considered a cost of the transaction, essentially. We always look to see if the reserves are restricted by either the partnership agreement or the lender. If you have HPD funding in your project at all, HPD has pretty much locked down the reserves from the beginning using their funding and disbursement agreement, which would essentially lower what the investor's return could be. In supportive housing specifically, you need to look at your rental subsidy contracts and how those could be transferred, how long they go out, when they expire. That can change the face value of the real estate. Always look at your real estate tax abatement, same thing. If that expires, that's going to affect the value. You need to know your extended use restriction period, how long that goes out. For a lot of supportive housing projects, it's longer than the 30 years to begin with. So that's something else to consider in your negotiations. A lot of times there are limited recapitalization options for preservation projects, but I'll let you guys get into what some of the fun options are. And we always have to check to make sure the investor benefits were delivered and the targets were met. So from there, go to our panel discussion.
So, Claire, at Enterprise, you've been doing a lot of these projects. Approximately how many supportive housing do you know offhand that you do actively or in your pipeline?
That's a good question. I would say maybe 20%. Probably, oh, I don't know. I think it really varies year to year, big time. Maybe 5 or 6 a year.
And do any of them re-syndicate in your 15? Is that a common?
We're seeing less and less re-syndications for the smaller projects. The city's resources are, well, I should probably let Kerry respond to this. So we're actually seeing the city make a push to find alternate financing strategies for projects rather than re-syndications at year 15.
And with the institutional buyers, which is a real big concern in our industry, with, can everyone hear me? So I'm just going to share the mic with you. The institutional buyers, and I know that Enterprise has really been sort of outside of that. How vulnerable do you think some of our projects are in that scenario?
Anecdotally, I've heard a handful of New York groups that have new limited partners and they're unfamiliar with what their motives are, what they're really looking for to get out of the project. I think it's a significant problem.
So I think we'll talk about that a little more as we go through the panel, but I do think for all of us that are facing year 15 or any sort of preservation where we have investors on any level, that we really have to be mindful that we are vulnerable to investors that are flipping our properties within their portfolios.
Yeah. I mean, so the partnership agreements are set out in a way that the limited partner would have consent rights to sales, and some of them have force of sale provisions that could really put properties at risk for not being preserved long term. Enterprise as a policy doesn't sell our limited partner interest off to buyers that might have those types of motives, but I think it is happening in the market.
Can I jump in with a question, Amy? Can I jump in with a question?
Please.
Can you, Claire, you talked about how Enterprise works, and I'm sympathetic to the point about works to achieve an advantageous exit for your nonprofit partners. Obviously, to the extent they're multi-investor funds, I don't know. I mean, can you just talk about that? And I see Dan here, and maybe he's setting the deals up initially, so maybe he wants to talk about it. But I mean, I just don't know how that works, especially on these older deals. I mean,
yeah, it really does depend. Dan, if you want to jump in, feel free. It depends on how the funds are set up at the beginning. There's a fund agreement where the syndicator serves as the general partner in the fund. In multi-investor funds, Enterprise generally is the point, and sometimes we'd have to go out and get multi-investor approvals for that type of thing. But I don't know, Dan, do you want to add to that?
Sure. Two points. I guess one is, as an organization, Enterprise does not sell off our limited partners. We don't. If you're working on Enterprise, you will be working on Enterprise in the next 15 years. Someone different won't just come along. That's the first point. And the second is, with our investors, when we're setting up our funds on the front end, Enterprise as an organization has a social mission. So those documents are negotiated in a specific way to give us some latitude of achieving the goals that they're laid out about preserving affordability. And so while, yes, we have to work with our investors and get approvals, there's a framework for that approval, which
So let's go on to Kerry at HPD to talk about the process of preservation there with year 15. Good morning. Do it this way so I don't overly confuse myself. Great, good morning everyone. Thanks so much for having me here today. I want to start with a snapshot of where the program is to date and how important the work of each owner in the Year 15 program is in helping us preserve these portfolios. As you can see, since the program started in fiscal year 08, we've closed 179 transactions. This represents 16,053 units. And we're on track this fiscal year to close an additional 2,400 units. Since the start of Housing New York, of these transactions, we repositioned 7 supportive housing projects representing 374 units. So supportive housing projects represent a smaller piece of our portfolio, but certainly, not portfolio, but fiscal year pipeline, but certainly represent a lot of the work that we do and are included in our Year 15 program as well. These transactions represent over 186 separate partnerships, repositioning ownership, but this pie chart doesn't capture the complexity and creativity that we use on each of these deals and the dedicated staff time from the sponsors, the technical assistance providers, and the attorneys who work for many months prior to starting the fiscal year to get these projects where they need to be. Is that feedback overly annoying to folks? Sorry, is that okay? Everyone's good? Okay. So what I want to cover today is what the Year 15 program is. You've probably heard about it in various ways. What we offer through this program and what you can begin working on now as you contemplate exiting your limited partner and repositioning the ownership of your project. So why do you need to go through HPD's Year 15 program? Many owners here today, as part of their initial tax credit financing, may have received land, subsidy, or tax credits from HPD. If that's the case for you, when you change the ownership structure at Year 15 to exit the limited partner, you must receive HPD consent. In order to provide this consent, we'll review the project's financials, the physical needs assessment to ensure that the project has sufficient reserves to fund immediate capital needs, meet operating and debt service payments with the current cash flow, has an M&O that's in line with our standards, and has a tax exemption that is sufficient for the project to operate through the end of the regulatory term. If all these standards are met and an owner does not want to extend affordability, we'll allow what we call a decoupling. And that's simply just an exit of the limited partner. Nothing changes, no tax exemption, no subsidy. We find, though, that this is rarely the case, and that owners in our pipeline do extend affordability, and as part of this often need additional subsidy to meet the immediate needs, debt restructuring to extend or modify the existing debt, and need a tax exemption to assist in the project's operations. In exchange for providing this, the debt modifications, tax exemptions, additional subsidy, will ask for a minimum of 15 years additional affordability beyond the end of your current regulatory agreement. We really view Year 15 as an opportunity to address issues within a portfolio, whether these are operational or physical, and in some cases, this may force issues that have been lingering for many years, such as high operating costs or old violations that have never been cleared, to be resolved. And Year 15 can help bring about this resolution and set the projects on a stronger operational foundation. The Year 15 program uses a number of tools to assist in this. We can extend and modify existing HPD mortgages. Most of the projects in our pipeline do have existing HPD debt. We offer a tax benefit to maximize project operating revenue, either a 420C or an Article 11. And we provide additional subsidy to fund the immediate capital needs, as well as the low-cost, no-cost greening measures. And we provide reserve subsidy to resize reserves. In addition, we may also modify the underlying documents that were put in place at closings. Claire referred to, you typically would have a funding and disbursement agreement, which governs the use of the reserves. And we can modify that FDA to allow a cash flow release rather than sweeping all the reserves as part of your Year 15 exit. And we can amend the regulatory agreement to provide for a tier of higher and lower AMIs. And where necessary, we may restructure legal rents, which is a rent restructuring, to bring in additional income to meet the operating needs. For projects that are operating strongly and do not need additional subsidy, we may release a portion of the existing reserves to the owner for use in future affordable housing projects. We do see this more typically in supportive housing projects because the reserves are
funded very healthy at the initial closing. So this tends to be more the case for the supportive housing projects, particularly if there's an operating contract in place. The year 15 pipeline, though, is changing, as Claire mentioned. The questions that we are facing now are very different than the issues of 5 years ago, approximately when I started working in the program as deputy director. We are seeing an uptick in acquisitions and difficult limited partner exits at the point of year 15, not with enterprise, of course, other projects. Regarding selling your portfolio at year 15, if you do want to sell your portfolio as part of your year 15 exit, please set up a time to talk with us, myself, HPD Asset Management, about options for selling your portfolio to a preservation buyer. We know this is part of what folks are looking at year 15, but what we want to do is kind of stem that tide of selling to a non-affordable buyer, someone who's not going to extend the regulatory agreement. A preservation buyer is an entity that has experience owning and managing a regulated portfolio, and they'll purchase the portfolio, they'll assume the existing HPD debt, and extend affordability. We're also seeing an increase around issues about exiting limited partners at year 15 that are requesting payment for their exit, or conversely, the limited partner may have no interest in exiting and prefers to stay in the project until some point after year 15. Both of these present a lot of issues on the city side, and this is a burgeoning issue that we're kind of dealing with right now on a project-by-project, case-by-case basis. These are typically investors that are not New York-based, not enterprise or not-for-profit investors, and we are solving these on an individual basis. So if you're experiencing this, please reach out and we can work with you and help advocate for the project on your behalf. We absolutely don't want to find ourselves in a situation where a sale is forced to pay the limited partner to exit. And we are working actively with owners to resolve these issues on a case-by-case basis. So please reach out to me afterwards if you want to talk about this, if this is affecting your project. We categorize year 15 projects by the applicable term sheet. These are repositionings and private debt and resyndications. This kind of decision tree helps lay out the typical path of a project depending on the physical needs and the project's ability to leverage other sources of debt. Repositionings are projects where HPD is the senior and only lender. This type of financing represents the bulk of our pipeline each fiscal year. What defines these projects as separate from the resyndication and the private debt model is that HPD is the gap lender between the available reserves and the immediate capital needs. Our subsidy is limited to systems replacement only, so the scope of work will address items like roofs, windows, boilers, and masonry work. To offset the need for subsidy, we always use the existing reserves first as a source before putting in additional subsidy. For larger portfolios, and this includes combining multiple existing partnerships that have capital needs beyond the year 15 term sheet and can even include non-tax credit portfolios, additional sources are needed to cover the gap. These projects should explore the private debt model. We have a private debt term sheet, all of our term sheets are on the website, to leverage conventional funds. In order to leverage new debt, we can subordinate and extend our existing debt to a concurrent term with a new senior lender coming in. Many owners of year 15 projects may want to work with other HPD preservation programs. We get a lot of inquiry as well. I'm just going to talk to you PLP or GHPP, where the term sheet limits are higher or the debt can be structured as a grant. But to simplify this, all owners of tax credit portfolios, whether you've already exited your limited partner or not, will come through the year 15 program. We've structured the program this way as projects with the existing debt and existing tax credit regulatory agreements have peculiar set of underlying circumstances that's best handled by the year 15 program. You can see we have the resyndication term sheet as well, but we are asking owners if they are considering a resyndication that they also model the transaction as a non-tax credit private debt transaction. We are seeing the need to kind of structure alternatives to resyndication. So again, feel free to reach out to talk about your project if that's what you're considering. To talk through a few of the important term sheet points, our subsidy limit across all term sheets is $20,000 a DU. For projects that need subsidy above our term sheet, we'll ask for longer affordability. This may include permanent affordability, deeper affordability, and an additional homeless set-aside. Our term sheet requires a minimum 10% homeless set-aside for all projects. If your project has an existing homeless set-aside, you will maintain and extend that same requirement going forward. In order to fill homeless vacancies, you'll work with HPD's Homeless Placement Unit. This is a unit that was created a few years ago and will handle all the initial and ongoing referrals. The mandatory homeless set-aside requirement was new in fiscal year 15, and it's been very encouraging to work with owners that have helped us think through how projects can accommodate this requirement. Since FY15, we've created or preserved over 600 homeless units, and this really speaks to the commitment of our partners to help make homeless housing a priority. We'll also work with owners to secure a tax exemption that will run concurrent with the new regulatory term. Again, that's the 420C or an Article 11. One change in our Article 11 process, if you are considering an Article 11, we're asking for a 6-month lead up on that approval. So this may have changed if you worked with HPD before. Just something to note on that exemption. Sponsors can also combine non-tax credit projects with tax credit projects that are coming through year 15 to leverage combined cash flows to bring in new sources of debt and address physical needs across multiple portfolios. So we see the year 15 moment as a real opportunity to bring in potentially an HDFC with a year 15 project and combine those and able to address the physical needs. I'm going to stop using my hands. Excuse me. To address the physical needs across both portfolios. So just in terms of time, what would you expect going through a loan repositioning with, or a project repositioning with year 15? Owners with projects in the pipeline should expect to spend about 2 to 4 hours per week during the application submission period. During this time, we'll review checklists, follow up on missing pieces, begin preliminary underwriting, and work through scope issues. Project managers on the HPD side will organize kickoff calls and may request bi-weekly calls depending on the nature of the project issues, the status of the underwriting, and other project requirements like violation removal, which we do require on the project and the full sponsor portfolio. As you get closer to closing, we'll start weekly calls with attorneys, and the time commitment will certainly increase approximately 6 to 8 hours at minimum a week. I'm sure Arlo might feel differently about that. Just to kind of, I think for folks who may not have a project that they've recently closed with HPD, I'm just trying to lay out sort of a general sort of time structure. I think what we see with year 15 owners is that people are coming into the program and may have 1 or 2 projects they closed, 8 or 10 years ago, and the kind of sea of HPD regulations has changed, and potentially you may not have staff available to work on year 15 projects specifically. So I'm trying to lay out the timing kind of view here, I think, to help manage expectations for people coming into the pipeline. So what can you do now? Our fiscal year 18 Part 1 application is due on June 12th. Our application is online. Projects that are considering private debt are a rolling application. It's advisable to follow this deadline as well for inclusion in the FY18 pipeline, even though that is a rolling application. Projects that are looking ahead beyond FY18 can start working on longer lead items like violation clearance, assessing M&O, taking rent increases, reviewing higher cost M&O items, and looking at the utility expenses across the board. And begin requesting your IPNAs. IPNAs are the Integrated Physical Needs Assessment. We'll talk more about it on the next slide. But we encourage sponsors to get 3 proposals from IPNA providers so you can compare the scope and the cost to make sure that they're in line with our reimbursable limits. You should also begin discussing the repositioning strategy now with your attorneys and your board and your syndicator. Which entity will be stepping in as owner? Will you be creating a new entity? What are the physical needs of the project? What are the needs going forward? Do you have other co-GPs who are also going to need to approve of the disposition strategy? How many other agencies are involved in your project? What level of consent will they need to provide in terms of exiting and creating a new ownership structure and potentially taking on additional debt? For example, if you have debt through the Housing Trust Fund, they have a checklist review process. That's a 3 to 6 month process, and owners must go through them to get their approval to change the ownership structure and take on new debt. So the Integrated Physical Needs Assessment, this is a live requirement. This is an updated requirement that's based on our Green Physical Needs Assessment that some of you may be familiar with, which was implemented a few fiscal years ago. The IPNA is a property evaluation tool that's being used jointly by HPD, HDC, and HCR. And this integrates energy, water, and health needs in a roof-to-cellar assessment. If you've previously done a GPNA, that's okay. Those are good for about 2 years, but moving forward, we're requesting that all owners use the IPNA. The provider list is still the same, but the RFQ is open, and new providers are welcome to apply if you have a firm that you'd like to work with on your IPNA. Thank you.
So we said these projects can be complicated. Kerry, can you talk a little bit, you did just now, but a lot of our supportive housing projects have multiple funding sources. When we start out, we'll have agreements that HCR and HHAP and HPD have all entered into for the development side. What happens when we get to this year 15 with all these different agencies?
Super question. A lot of emails and a lot of phone calls to start. I think the first thing when you're kind of looking at repositioning a project is really to look at who has what on this project and what do they need to approve when I want to change X, Y, or Z. Are you taking on additional subsidy? Are you changing your ownership structure? What do those regulatory agreements lay out in terms of the consent provisions? So I think reaching out to the agencies early on, talking about what you're contemplating and your timing is critical. You know, HHAP, I think they come in as, you know, co-equal with our debt. So there is some coordination that has to happen between our two agencies. HCR has a different process if they're lending their housing trust fund subsidy, and they have the checklist. So I think in terms of just coordination, understanding the consents that are required and giving yourself a bit of time on that and having open communication and making those requests early to the agencies is critical. There are your asset managers that you're working with there. In terms of structuring the regulatory agreements, I think we certainly as part of year 15 aren't going to structure something that's going to make the project infeasible. We're not going to not require homeless if you have to, you know, have homeless for your HHAP agreements. So our regulatory agreement will take into account and combine, and we understand that there are existing restrictions that exist on the project. And that goes for the homeless requirement as well. I think, you know, some folks, when we work with them, they have to take a certain number from DHS because you have DHS contracts in place. So again, we're sensitive to that. I think the overall idea about our homeless placement unit, that our requirement is that you come through HPD to fill those referrals, but if there is an additional agency or requirement that lays on, you know, kind of has something stricter, we will work with you and try to structure that. We don't want to do anything to interrupt the operations of the project at year 15.
So are you seeing a lot of pushback from investors on, I mean, you touched on it a bit, but is it a common, are you seeing that?
Definitely seeing it more. I think as our pipeline changes, as we're working, you know, I think the majority of our pipeline has been with NYEF and NEF funds that are through LISC and Enterprise. We're seeing as the pipeline changes that we're seeing, you know, other investors, and there are different questions about their exit based on, you know, kind of the valuation where the project's located, how the LPA is structured. So I think we're sort of dealing with this issue right now on a case-by-case basis, but certainly it's, you know, there's definitely an uptick in the past year, and I see that, you know, increasing going forward, certainly.
And is the city able to leverage any sort of support for the not-for-profit developer in working with, you know, an outside investor that we don't know?
Absolutely. I think what I see, kind of my position as on the year 15 side is really to sort of help explain. I think a lot of the folks that we're talking to that are not familiar with New York, they're not familiar with New York housing, and understanding what it means to extend affordability, to enter into a new regulatory term, that your reserves are restricted, they are, you know, a piece of the project. I think having that conversation and speaking from the agency perspective can be helpful, and I think we're happy right now to sort of take that role on a project-by-project basis.
So we're going to ask Arlo to come up now, and we will open this all up to questions after all the presentations are completed.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I hesitate to do this, but I do feel some need. Our industry had a real personal blow this week. Probably a lot of you know Heather Gershon or Aaron Kaufman. And unfortunately, their little baby died at a very young age. So I just wanted to start by just taking 10 seconds of silence, if we could, and just send out some good wishes to them. Thank you. Just, let's see. right, great. So, I had encouraged Robin to have a year 15 panel this year because I had the good fortune of going through the process for the first time last year with Kerry and her team, and definitely learned a lot. And I give Kerry a lot of credit and the rest of her team. It's not, the city has very articulated goals, and she will fight for them. And I respect that a lot. I don't always agree, but those goals don't always exactly match up with the goals of the sponsor entity, which is okay. We're used to that in affordable housing. But I will say that her program thinks through things. They're open to suggestions, and as much of, doing this stuff, year 15, as Kerry kind of alluded to, it's a time when all the warts and kind of junk that's been piling up on your properties becomes clear, and it's not always a pretty thing to look at as an owner. Those violations that Kerry mentioned, and certain do-tos and do-froms that have accumulated over the years. So it's it's like a lot of asset management. It's not always the most fun, but it is an opportunity, I think, as Kerry mentioned, to really get your property cleared up in a good way, both from a capital standpoint and an operating standpoint, hopefully for the next 15 or 30 years. So, I give the city a lot of credit for thinking through. And with that editorial, I'll move on. So, I'm at SUS. We're a nonprofit social service provider at our heart. We do a lot of supportive housing. We're one of the biggest in the state. I'm not going to go through a lot of this. We're very big. We're very important. We're doing a lot of new development. So one thing, I wanted to sort of get into our portfolio, because of course that's what I care about, but also that I think it does highlight some of the issues and tensions within supportive housing in particular, and year 15. So the way I see it is our portfolio, right now we have 16 LPs, about 8 of them are either already past year 15 or rapidly in the next year or two approaching. So this is a real issue for us. And our portfolio, can kind of be divided into 2 tranches, the way I see it. One is the new construction, kind of heavily subsidized from a Section 8 or operate rent standpoint. And that's about half our portfolio has that. Those projects are pretty easy to run and pretty easy to look at in year 15 for the most part because of that big section, hopefully they were built well and they had that nice Section 8 contract for 60 or even 100% of the units. So even with high operating costs, which we do have, frankly, on most of our portfolio, as a lot of supportive housing does, the rent subsidy makes it at least able to cash flow and keep up a decent property. The other side of our portfolio, and some of this, SUS merged with Palladia 2 years ago, and Palladia had a lot of deals that were mod, they were not new construction, they were mod rehab deals. And those deals are a little bit harder to look at and to make work, both from an operational standpoint and from a year 15 standpoint. So those deals have less project-based Section 8. They're sort of in the 20 to 40 unit range. And I'm sure a lot of the other providers have, I know people who took over existing portfolios have this kind of, there are a lot of walk-ups. There's some deferred maintenance. The cash flow is kind of barely breaking even. And so most of our year 15 properties fall in that category. And so we have some challenges to look at how do we position those, and opportunities obviously, how do we position those properties in a better way going forward. So you see here my little chart, the older properties are mostly city land, or we got the properties from the city, they're smaller, they're mod rehabs, it's all agency debt, either HPD or trust funds. The newer deals are new construction, they're more joint ventures, there is hard debt, so that'll be an added wrinkle going forward. So here's our chart. I realize this is a little bit small. I guess that means it's really small. So basically this is our, yeah, wow, that's too bad. So let me summarize. So we have, this is 7 LPs that will be at year 15, or either are already through year 15 or will be in the next 2 years. And so it's a total of 230 units. Most of them are in the Bronx. A few of them are in Harlem, one of them is in Brooklyn. And so I think that's probably all that we need to say right for this moment. So what are our goals? So these are our SUS's goals in looking at our year 15 portfolio. Number one always is to provide quality housing for our residents. Number two is to preserve the asset. These are assets, and especially after year 15, we will own them 100%, and they're assets, and there should be a balance sheet asset to SUS going forward. We also are looking to, since we have a portfolio, look to create economies of scale, improve our operations, and do a lot of the cleanup stuff that I mentioned and Kerry talked about, and getting these properties in a better footing, and also lower the M&O costs, which Kerry will make you do anyway. So it's good to start thinking about. And then we also, which I alluded to, and this is sort of the toughest part I have with the HPD process, is to try and create cash value to the sponsor entity, the parent entity, in the year 15 process. So this kind of gets at, as I said, of our 7 portfolios, they kind of break out into two categories. 3 of them have at least decent cash flow and healthy reserves. And so for those, we have the goals, we're really trying to access some of that reserve money for the parent entity to the extent we can, meet all the other goals that we talked about. For the other 4 properties, we're really are really in the, I wouldn't say struggling, but in the middling range. These have some deferred capital expenditures and some, as I said, middling cash flow, and we're looking to recapitalize to hopefully access some of the HPD additional debt to make capital repairs and to get them on a more solid cash flow and M&O perspective footing. So Kerry's list kind of got at some of this, but from the sponsor's point of view, these are some strategies I would encourage my fellow partners to look at as early as possible. And a lot of it is just good asset management generally. And I want to give a plug here to Enterprise. We participated in their Asset Management University last year, which was really a terrific course to help think through a lot of these issues. So to the extent they do it again, and I don't know if they will, I would encourage groups to consider participating. So, we're in the age of big data, and it gets overhyped, but I would say that for us, data collection is an ongoing effort to look at, especially financial and operating performance of our limited partnerships. And there's data everywhere. We have yearly audits and various reports going out, but in a way that the challenge is to synthesize it in a way that someone like me or my boss, the chief financial officer, or the CEO, or the board can review in an ongoing way and try and provide strategic guidance to someone like Kyle Irvin, who's here, who's on my staff and is working on this year 15, who's in this data collection mode on a regular basis.
he obviously is looking at numbers weekly or monthly, so is hopefully our asset management team and our property managers, but our CFO, you know, who's managing a $200 million organization, is not going to look at monthly financial reports for all 16 of our LPs. But he should be looking at something about, at least quarterly or annually, for the financial performance of our LPs and not get surprised when the audits come out. So that's a real challenge. The Asset Management University definitely helped, but you know, now we actually have to do the work, which is a challenge. Rent collection, I was just talking to someone about this, always a challenge for SUS. I suspect we're not alone. You know, part of it is just being organized. Part of it is that the tenant portion is extremely challenging to collect from our consumers. Allocating costs, you know, at all of our buildings we have both a social service program and LP, and there are some shared expenses, often security costs, often cleaning supplies, some other smaller things. To get those actually allocated, central maintenance, my time, to get those allocated correctly is a real chore. It's important and we should do it, but it's not easy. We talked a little bit about preventive maintenance and in doing regular capital assessments. We shouldn't be waiting for year 15 to be doing capital, at least internal capital assessments of our buildings. A lot of our buildings were surprised to find that we actually have reserve. We've been deferring maintenance, but we actually had reserves. That was just poor management, to be honest, on our part. We should have been using those reserves to keep up the physical. And I talked about our goals for year 15 programs generally. So I think with that, I'll end it.
Thank you, Arlo. So, Arlo, as someone that runs a department that has been focused on development, did you have to restructure staffing? I mean, how do you account for the time associated with year 15? I mean, that's got to be, Kerry talked about the time that you have to, and I suspect on your end it's maybe even more time than we discussed previously.
Yeah, I think that was part of the education I got last year when we went through our year 15 transaction, was that it is a lot of time, and you know, especially as an organization who hadn't been spending a lot of time on asset management, like all those warts, you know, Kerry gave you a list. You have to pay every single violation over $1,000, all the ACBs. You know, it's not. So yes, it is a time, and we had to definitely allocate some more staff time. Now with this bigger portfolio, we are looking for some consulting help to help us, because it's frankly beyond what our staff can currently take on. But yes, it's definitely a time commitment.
So does anyone here on the panel have some questions for Arlo?
I guess, you know, from the city side, we always say, you know, reduce your M&O. Do you have any advice for, I guess, thinking about owners now, things that they could look at specifically, or programs that you found helpful from the city side, the DEP side, that folks can be looking at now to implement prior to coming up to year 15?
I wish I had a great answer, but I think we're still sort of learning the various programs and getting there.
Okay, so our next panelist is David Kamnitzer, and David, as I mentioned earlier, is with ICL. That's Institute for Community Living.
So good afternoon. It's great to be here. I just want to start out by saying, again, thank you to Robin and Shinny for recognizing the importance of really bringing in the consumer voice into this workshop, because none of this really could happen without the buy-in from the persons that we serve. So really important. So also, just a very quick overview of who we are at ICL. We too are a large agency. We have the full spectrum of housing at ICL. We serve, we house close to 3,000 folks each evening, from 2 shelters. One is a 200-bed women's shelter for women who have severe and persistent mental illness, to a veteran shelter out in Long Island City. We have congregate housing, SROs, we have apartment treatment programs, and then, of course, our supported housing. And within that, we have specialized populations, including the MRT group and the adult home supported housing, for example. We serve the full gamut of populations out there, POPs A, B, C, D. Those are letters many of you know, folks coming out of long-term state hospitals, coming from the shelter system, young adults. We're serving the active substance abusers and also substance abusers who are committed to treatment. So we absolutely have our challenges, but we're out there each day and always trying to instill hope and do all the good inspirational work that goes with this business. To get into this project, I'm going to introduce one of my colleagues who's going to talk about the actual development piece of the project, and then I'll come back and bring in some other more clinical issues. This is a gentleman that many of you know, Joe Bieber, who not only is a passionate individual who's been in the housing arena for many, many years, but also a very compassionate and very thoughtful man. And the way we really work is that we can't do this work in silos. So, Joe's development team and my operations team are constantly collaborating. We have weekly work group meetings, and we can't do any of this work without that communication. So let me welcome Joe. You want to come on up? And
A kind introduction, David. Hi. So I've been working with ICL for the past few years, ostensibly on development, but it became pretty clear early on that it dovetails with preservation, though that wasn't the leading goal. It's really become almost a parallel track on some of the projects. And since ICL is 30 years old and worked almost entirely on OMH-financed residential programs, mostly in the 1990s, the housing portfolio, which is about 25 properties, is aging and in need of attention. But because OMH was not taking advantage of low-income housing tax credits 15 plus years ago, these are not projects that were syndicated. It's only more recently that OMH has gotten into the use of 4% credits, and ICL has done some more recent projects. But we're really sort of focusing now on the older stock. So the issue isn't really sort of how do you sort of reprogram and disengage at 15 years, because it's not a 15-year issue. It's really more bumping up against the physical issues of the buildings and how to extend the life of the buildings, but also trying to catch up with best practices in the field, which have evolved quite a bit in the intervening years, as much as 30 years. So early SROs and transitional housing may have been the model back then. Those have changed. So we're really looking at sort of 2 distinct tracks for preservation. One is the redevelopment of some of the larger, older properties that in several cases also have additional development opportunities. So it can create not just an opportunity to preserve housing, but to expand housing opportunities. And the 2 cases I'll talk about, it's roughly double the square footage. The other track is looking at smaller properties which have sort of more of a moderate rehab with tenants in place approach. The redevelopment, because it's extensive, requires relocation of all tenants, and David will talk about some of the issues involved in relocation as well as rehab with tenants in place. The first redevelopment project is Nevins. I guess I'm supposed to do this, right? I'm not quite sure how to bring this up, but I have two renderings, but let me continue to talk. So 50 Nevin Street was originally developed as a YWCA in downtown Brooklyn at the corner of Nevins and Skirmerhorn. It was ICL's original property and is about 30 years under ownership now, built in, I think, 1914. So this is, you can see the original site. Next door is a parking lot also owned by ICL, which had potential additional development rights, but the building was fully built out. So we've been going through a rezoning and upzoning to enable us to build in the parking lot, and as you can see, overbuild 2 stories. So it's now 150 room SRO, very much like the original YWCA, will be reconfigured into 129 self-contained apartments. So it will roughly double the square footage. It will modernize from SROs in what's really an institutional setting now to self-contained apartments. It will also catch up with programmatic changes, so it'll be supportive mixed with affordable housing, 60% supportive, 40% affordable, and will now comply with the Olmstead law as well, which, as I'm sure you know, requires that disabled persons be fully integrated. So the original OMH projects, which were exclusively mentally ill, are out of compliance currently. So that's 15 Evans Street, and we're at the sort of tail end of the Euler process now, and looking to start construction late next year. And that will use sort of the traditional development financing products, not specifically preservation. Preservation is occurring, and in a neighborhood, by the way, that we could never afford today. I mean, these, because they were required so many years ago, downtown Brooklyn was not hot property. We're also working in Crown Heights and in Clinton Hill and Park Slope on properties. Again, that would be entirely unaffordable if we tried to go out today. So it's preserving integration within the neighborhood as well, I suppose you could say. And then the other project involving redevelopment is 839 St. Mark's Avenue, which I guess, again, I think I need a little help here. So 839 St. Mark's is actually a historic mansion in Crown Heights, directly across from the Brooklyn Children's Museum. It's a historic mansion, you can see on the left, built in 1868, and it's in the Crown Heights North Historic District. So the idea here was to, again, preserve the housing, which is currently, which was 48 transitional units, again, OMH license, and take advantage of unused development rights in the side yard, which was about 40,000 square feet. What you can't see is around the corner, the addition continues. There's a 6-story building on Brooklyn Avenue, so it's basically an L wrapping the mansion. The dad architects, so the architects for both projects. And they came up with a scheme that is very contextual, as you can see, received Landmarks Preservation Commission approval last spring, which unlocked those unused development rights. So what is now a 48 SRO and shared room setting will become a 70-unit self-contained apartments, skewed towards studios. Again, conventional financing through HPD Supportive Housing Loan Program, the Office of Mental Health Capital, for HPD for 9% tax credits. Just mentioned on Nevins, we're using tax-exempt bonds from the state along with as a right 4% credit. So again, preserving, expanding housing opportunities, modernizing, and through redevelopment. So we're trying to sort of leverage ICL's existing portfolio for additional housing as well as preserving. The other track that we're using, which is a little less exotic, is using the Office of Mental Health's existing buildings fund to preserve smaller community residences and supportive housing that is now 20 to 30 years old, 20, 25 years old, in need of moderate rehab, replacement of kitchens, baths, and flooring, and so on. And OMH has a program which frankly is not sufficient to address the statewide need. I believe it's about $10 million per year statewide, which really I don't think gets close to the need. We're also exploring the possibility of bundling 5 or 6 of these smaller properties into one tax credit syndication. We're talking to a syndicator about possibly syndicating for the first time really to be able to do a broader scope of rehab and extend the life even further. That's, just being explored, and I can't tell you whether it's going to work or not, but that's the track we're using there, sort of a scattered site syndication approach. So that's the approach we're using. We're going to run out of opportunities for redevelopment, eventually, pretty soon, after one more of these. And then, I think it's really looking at the smaller properties that need the next 15, 20 years in terms of their physical needs. So let me take it back.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Joe. So this project is currently long underway. Discussions really began 2 years ago with the State Office of Mental Health. And of course, the overarching theme is what Joe alluded to, which was Olmsted, which suggests that we're really coming from a recovery standpoint. The idea that we want to try and create as sort of normalized a setting as possible, and that for too long, this residence, and as beautiful as it is, and our other residents on Nevin Street, were really very large residences which had an institutional-like feeling. And so our challenge was, what do we do about this? We met with OMH and had many meetings with them, and ultimately we came up with a model where we would convert the existing beds here into treatment apartments. And so this residence, which is St. Mark's, is currently empty now. We just finished moving our last tenants out. We did it actually after all the approvals beginning March 1, and we just moved our last residents out. We are fortunate in that we have a large congregate stock. Not everyone was able to go into their own apartment, for different reasons. Of course, that was all of this was done very thoughtfully through collaboration with clinicians and therapists and family members and the individuals themselves. So development of the apartments obviously was also a challenge in Brooklyn. We opened here 24 two-bedroom apartments, and we managed to place them successfully. What we use in all our models is, a philosophy of care that we have developed. We call it our TRIP model. Essentially, it's seeing our folks through a trauma-informed lens. The R meaning recovery-oriented. The I is an integrated care perspective, integrated physical and behavioral health, and P is person-centered. So as we do these transitions, it's always in collaboration, as I said earlier, with the stakeholders. And then, of course, it's working with staff, it's working with community partners. In this instance, Joe referenced the Brooklyn Children's Museum, which is across the street. They were a key, and they have been a sort of a key partner with our residents for many years. Every October, we hold a big pumpkin patch Halloween fest in our garden, and for them it was quite a loss, the idea of having to lose the garden and for us to develop it. So a lot of sort of discussions with them about how to preserve part of the garden, and obviously it was our intention to try and preserve these important partnerships, again, to get the buy-in from key stakeholders. Lots of meetings with elected officials about this, lots of meetings where we really wanted to be very transparent during community board meetings, so we have always invited our architects to really go over the renderings, to go over the screenings. There was, especially with this project, some neighborhood opposition, again, because of the history of this building in the neighborhood and that it is such a beautiful building and a landmarks building. So that took some hurdles to get through, but you know, we through a lot of collaboration and, as I said, transparency and working together, we really made this work. So that's about it for this. You know, of course, what follows now is just, you know, all the due diligence that we have to do to ensure that we are moving folks thoughtfully, and we're doing it with their voice, and we're doing it with you know, a sense of responsibility. So you know, as we discussed these new models with OMH, for instance, if you think about the treatment apartment model, you know that typically folks may get a visit once a week. Well, some of the folks who are living in these facilities who really needed that 24-hour level of care are now living in the community and are going to need daily visits from their care, from their workers. So it's really working also to put together a safe care plan. And so it's bringing care coordination into this, at times bringing parole into this, at times bringing the ACT teams into this. And so it's really thinking comprehensively about what's going to keep people safe out of the hospitals and successfully integrated.
Thank you, Dave. I just have a quick question for you and Joe. You know, tenant in place, or moving tenants in New York City when you're doing any kind of preservation or redevelopment project is really complicated. Did your tenants have leases? Were you, no, so they were...
So these were all transitional residential programs, so they didn't have an issue that you would if they had a lease.
And occupancy agreements.
Okay.
So because they were what we call the level 2, a higher level of care, it's not a standard lease that they had.
Okay. Well, I'm really happy for you that you were able to accomplish that. For those of us that have lived through tenants in place renovations or have tried to move folks, you know that that is something we're facing in this, and it takes a lot of time, a lot of perseverance, and a huge amount of legal expense. And patience. So I want to thank our panelists, but I'd like to open up questions to the floor. Any of you that are facing preservation?
Hi. I think this is particularly to Arlo, but really anybody on the panel. You talked about that cost sharing between the LP side and the social service side, and trying to kind of improve that. Do you have any luck with maybe swapping out or adding any social service funding? Because that's sort of our struggle. We can't really cost share that much if the other side doesn't have any money. So either. Any luck doing any of that?
In terms of putting some of the more expense on the social service budget, or the other way around?
On the social service budget, so improving, we have very little funding on the social service side as
Right.
well, so, there's not much to shift over. And if you had any luck sort of improving the funding on that side at all? So we do better cost sharing with that?
No, I was really talking more about it from an accounting perspective, actually accurately, putting the costs in the right buckets per the cost. But I do think you're touching on something which is, many other shinny panels I'm sure will address, is about the inadequacy of the service funding, particularly for the older, for the existing projects. I mean, we particularly feel this on the scatter site model, even more on the congregate housing. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting when I look back at our portfolio how the differences in like the security costs. So it runs the whole gamut from the LP picking up 100% to the social service budget picking up 100%, and there doesn't seem to be. It's strange to me that there's so much variety within that.
We've had some pretty good success appealing to, I mean, these are small dollars, as you know, but there's that 5K enhanced funding that OMH gives per client, but you have to come up with a good justification for that. Obviously, RAP dollars are available for special needs. We had, in a number of instances, we've had folks who have needed around-the-clock care and how to figure that out and how to pay for it. So, you know, we had to come up with good clinical justification for OMH to pay for this, and they did.
Any other questions?
I have a question. So Joe, you were talking about bundling, that you were trying to bundle a bunch of your properties together to do a year 15 recertification. I'm just curious about that because we do have a lot of providers that have a diverse portfolio that could benefit from the economies of scale of trying to do those together. So I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about that.
It wasn't a re-syndication, you're routine because they were never syndicated, it's really
Okay.
syndicated for the first time.
Okay.
And a way to perhaps expand the scope of the renovation, which is constrained by OMH funding, and it's, we can't do additional debt. So, you know, none of the buildings included on their own would work, but as a package, that would be probably around $12 million or so. It starts to get to the threshold where you can consider syndicating.
Okay.
Maybe I can find that in the demand on that. You know, in terms of what's the right threshold efficiency with scattered sites.
I can speak from the city side at least for the financing, but this is just strictly from the year 15 perspective, is that when, you know, we see projects around our minimum requirement for re-syndication is 300 units. So that could be, you know, a number of partnerships, but the 300 units is our threshold, but that's just on the preservation side. And there's absolutely an opportunity to bundle a tax credit project that has to come through year 15 with an HDFC or a non-tax credit project. So that's on for, you know, for portfolios that already have been syndicated previously. On your side, I don't know how you view kind of on a non-year 15 side.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add, we're seeing a lot of interest in bundling from the perspective of doing a private debt structure because there's more flexibility under that term sheet in terms of setting the scope of work. When you do the standard repositioning with, you know, a single project, there's less, you have less control over what the scope of work can be. And then if you can bundle it and support some private debt, support, you know, with HPD debt subordinate, that gives you a little more flexibility on that front. Arlo, do you want to talk about how you're looking at your portfolio in terms of what might work as a bundle?
So of course, I love tax credit development, so I would love to re-syndicate. You know, we're at 230 units, so below Kerry's 300. I mean, my sense is, and Kerry's really the should guide, what I've been hearing is even if you have 300 units, it's going to be a couple of years that you're going to have to wait, just in terms of the bond cap allocation. So, yeah, so we're looking at, you know, I think it's hard for a lot of supportive housing to look at supporting new debt, hard debt, I should say. I mean, I'm certainly open to it, but I think I would be, I don't know if anyone's done it, but I would be very interested to hear if anyone has done a new hard debt scenario with existing supportive housing, because it's hard to make it work from my perspective. You got to be really good on your M&L to make that work.
Not yet.
Not yet. Not yet.
I would say just if you are thinking about a re-syndication, to, you know, model it both ways. I don't think we have any sort of ability to really predict bond cap allocation, so I think we're really looking for alternatives. I think that scope of work is going to be your tipping point in terms of what you can support, as Arlo pointed out, and the, you know, really the condition of the property. So if you're thinking about that as part of year 15, model it both ways, come and talk with us, and, you know, we'll figure it out.
And then I just have one last question. You know, some of our older projects, when we look back 20, 25 years ago, it seemed like there were a lot of vacant lots. There was a lot of land available. I don't think any of us foresaw that land was going to be so hard to come by. So we didn't always build out our buildings. A lot of our buildings have FAR on the table. Arlo, have you done an assessment at SUS if all your buildings are built out? Have you considered what ICL is doing?
Well, we have not done a complete assessment, which I would love to do. But first of all, it's great projects that, David, I did not know. I happen to take my kids to the Children's Museum regularly and have noticed that building in the past. So very glad to hear that it's supportive housing and the rehab and also my daughter goes to school right around Evans Street. So anyway, but really exciting project, so I'm happy to hear about them, and it's I'm excited to consider that for some of SUS's non-tax credit, old OMH portfolio. We are, one project I believe, Amy, you said you worked on, Jerome Court, which is severely underbuilt, and what we're actually looking there is to do a tear down and
That would be good.
build, this was one of the mod rehab. It was actually a Hot Sheets Motel back in the 60s and 70s that Palladia took over in 1990 and did a mod rehab, and has been 40 Hasa studios providing important housing for people who need it, but not the best permanent housing from just it's motel rooms, and that's what it has been. So we're hoping to demolish that and build what we hope is going to be 11 stories of 140 apartments, a mix of studios and family units and ground floor retail and a whole bunch of other exciting stuff. Our sticking point there is the Jerome Corridor rezoning, which is also not for this discussion, but an interesting political football that's being tossed around. And so our project is pretty much dependent on that rezoning going through.
And Kerry, are you seeing any projects coming in that want to preserve and expand?
Not in earnest yet. I think we see that more around the HUD multifamily portfolio and the 202s, which have yet to kind of come into the year 15 sphere. I don't think it's impossible. I think we're absolutely willing to explore that, but I haven't quite yet seen anything specific to year 15 that contemplates that. But I think that's definitely coming for us.
And are you seeing projects, is your unit doing projects that are maybe not tax credit projects, that are that need to refi on HPD, or are they going to other preservation projects?
Those would go to other preservation units, so that would more likely fall under our PLP or our GHPP. GHPP is the Green Housing Preservation Program, and PLP is the Preservation Loan Program. So a project that never received tax credits, that is non-supportive housing, would go likely to either of those preservation programs.
Unless it was part of a bundle, right? So you've done one building into this tax credit and you bundle with some other HDFCs.
Yeah, unless you're coming in with a tax credit project and that's like the cornerstone of your not cornerstone, but a piece of your project, then that would come through year 15. You never received tax credits before, and that would go through another loan program.
Well, it sounds like your program is very flexible.
We try to be. As much as we can be.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I want to thank our panelists.
Thank you.